15th century European armour perhaps reached the apex of protection. We could say maybe the 16th century even perfected it a little bit further and increased a little bit of mobility while also increasing certain bits of protection. But what many people don't realise is that some aspects of 15th century armour, although it became pretty much flawlessly protective in the late 15th century, achieved that in very different ways in different places. So superficially, this Italian pauldron shown here might appear very similar to this English pauldron shown here, but actually they work quite differently and for different reasons. So why did the Italians make pauldrons that look like this, while the English made pauldrons that looked more like this? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, obviously here we're looking at two of my armours, my main two armours. One of them is actually technically kind of French or Burgundian, however it's fundamentally, mechanically, basically Italian. It's an Italian export armour. Whereas the other armour we're looking at here is English. Now there's many parts to this armour and we're going to be looking at those in future videos. But there's just one particular aspect I want to focus on in this video, and that is pauldrons, that is shoulder defences. So here we have the left-hand pauldron, which fulfills and kind of replaces the role of the shield in many aspects, and we'll come back to that in a second. And this is the right-hand pauldron. Now, the first thing to say about Italian pauldrons is they are asymmetrical. You'll notice the one for the left is very much bigger than the one for the right. That's for a number of reasons. One, because you're primarily, certainly by right-handed people, struck on your left-hand side, whether it's from lances or pole axes or swords or whatever. So this side kind of needs more protection, but equally, assuming you are right-handed, this side needs a bit more mobility. So generally speaking, the right-hand pauldron is smaller and lighter than the left-hand pauldron. But in addition to that, you'll also notice if we look at the shape of these, the right-hand pauldron has a cutout on it. Just put the big left-hand pauldron down for a second, and this is to enable the couching of the lance. So you can get your lance into your armpit there. So this is very much dictated by cavalry use, and the fact that, remember that knights, despite the fact that I personally don't ride, or I've ridden a little bit, but I wouldn't call myself a rider. I don't ride, but most knights in period would have been excellent riders, and that would have been instilled in them since childhood. And absolutely the fundamental purpose of a knight, certainly in the beginning, was to fight on horseback, primarily with a lance. And obviously once the lance breaks or gets stuck in someone, then you pull out a sword or a warhammer or whatever, but primarily with a lance. So they're heavy cavalry using lances primarily. However, the English were a little bit different to that, but we'll come back in a second to that point. So Italian pauldrons not only have these flexible elements here, okay, which can compress and enable you to move your arm a reasonable amount, but in addition, they are famous and very recognisable for having these additional guards that go by a series of different names, guard brace and various other things. We won't get into that, but fundamentally this provides extra protection. But you'll notice they have a little removable pin on there, and if you remove that pin, you lose a bit of protection, but you gain a bit of mobility. But the interesting point here when talking about English pauldrons is fundamentally we've got these quite large, and admittedly my armour are particularly large, not all Italian ones are quite this big, but particularly large. You've got a fairly large one on the right hand side, but now if I go back to the left hand pauldron, which remember is there to take the place to some degree of a shield, replace the shield, is really quite large. Now that dictates how much you can move your arms, because admittedly while it is pointed or laced via those holes to the top of your doublet or your mail voiders, as I do it here, you can lift your arm up quite high, but there is always a limitation to how high you can lift it, because this is one large plate and it will clash with the side of your neck or your helmet or your bever that you'll be wearing in addition to this. But you'll notice that even on the inside, that lower plate is one quite large plate. Now in the 16th century they come to other, or in fact at the end of the 15th, they come to other ways of enabling more mobility while still having one large plate, but we'll maybe look at those in a different video. But fundamentally, your ability to lift your arm up here is limited to that bridge essentially between your arm and your neck, one large plate, which in this case is filled with a large extra guard plate. And this offers a huge amount of protection, whether it's against lances, poleaxes, arrows, whatever, because you've essentially got 2 layers of steel that you would have to get through were you to try and get through that. And frankly, no handheld weapons are going to be getting through that anytime soon. Even an arrow or a crossbow bolt, which got through the first plate, would have lost so much energy it wouldn't get through the second plate. So they're hugely protective. Okay, so now let's put those down for a second and let's go to the English armour. So this is based on the effigy of Sir Humphrey Blunt in Kinlet, dated to about 1470. He actually lived beyond that, but he had the effigy made during his lifetime, almost certainly based on his actual armour and his actual face and his haircut and everything. It was supposed to be a complete life likeness. So in this case, if I go to the left pauldron, so you will notice that it does have a reinforcing plate that is literally in the shape of a shield, or bouche, or Taj, various names they go by, but you'll notice it's even got the cutout that a jousting shield would have. And we've talked a bit about these shields recently, actually, in recent videos, but you'll notice it doesn't cover as much of an area. Now, funnily enough, the Italians also used to do this and have a smaller reinforced plate there. If we go back to kind of like the 1420s, 1430s, when they first started having these large pauldrons, which really starts in about 1410, by about 1420 they were often adding on these reinforcers, but they were often just like a roundel, a disc, and sometimes other funky shapes, sometimes a shield shape. So there's an important point to note here, and that is that these asymmetrical pauldrons, I'll just pick up the other English one for a second, these asymmetrical pauldrons, where just like the Italian, the right is smaller than the left for all the aforementioned reasons, this is an Italian thing. So when I'm talking about English armour, yes, this Humphrey Blunt's armour that mine is based on almost certainly was made in England. It debatably could have been made abroad in the English style, but probably was made in England and is very distinctively English. It still has Italianate features because, of course, Italian armour had been imported into England for decades and imported all over Europe, to France, Spain, even to Germany. So Italian features came into more regional styles, and that's what we see here. So the asymmetrical pauldrons are an Italian feature. However, you'll notice they're carried out a little bit differently here. So this left-hand pauldron has a smaller reinforce, but it doesn't have such a large lower plate, with the consequence that the entire pauldron can compress into a much smaller space. In reality, for fighting, when you're using something like a poleaxe or, well, just any weapon really, but particularly with poleaxes, you notice it, it means that in contrast to the Italian armour, I can lift my arm much higher because there's a shorter bridge between my inner elbow, my arm, and my neck. Okay, so that essentially concertinas up into a smaller area. Not to say there weren't Italian pauldrons like this, there were, we'll come back to that in a second, but the average Italian pauldron from the same time as this usually has a larger, more immobile left shoulder piece. And in fact, when I've been teaching lessons and even doing some reenactment stuff, I sometimes take my left pauldron off, or at the very least to reinforce on the Italian armour so that I can move my arms more. But let's just look at the English right arm. That doesn't have any real reinforce at all, or does it? Well, it actually does. So this lower plate here isn't just one sheet of steel. It may look like it on screen, but if you'll notice there's a border edge, and this is shown very clearly on the effigy. So actually that bottom edge there is actually 2 layers of steel. So it does have a reinforce, but the reinforce is not bigger than the lame underneath. Therefore, the entire thing can concertina up into a very small area, enough to just cover the top of the deltoid. So when that's laced me here, I can lift my arm fully over my head and it doesn't clash in. So the natural question is, why did the English, or at least some, not to say all English effigies are the same, some of them have larger reinforces, but there does seem to be a tendency to have more compressible and smaller shoulders than your typical pick up the Italian one again, than your typical Italian one, which has this long bridge that's going to get stuck between your arm and your head. Well, the tempting answer is because the English like to fight on foot. Now, if you didn't know that, just very briefly, so during the 100 Years' War with France, the English evolved, going all the way back into the 14th century, back at the Battle of Crécy, and probably even before that, evolved a fighting style that they maintained and kept all the way for a good 100 years, and really you could say into most of the Wars of the Roses engagements, of fighting on foot. And this was globally across Europe. This is relatively unusual, not massively unusual in the sense that the French also did it at certain battles, at Poitiers, and at most of them at Agincourt and various other engagements. But why was it? Well, the standard explanation is longbows. Now, I don't think that's the full answer. It's far more complex than that, but that's a topic for another video because it's a very meaty subject by itself. But what we can say categorically is the English knights or men-at-arms had a tendency of liking to fight on foot and accentuating foot combat. The French were also famous for using poleaxes on foot, particularly the Burgundians. If we look at the deeds of Jacques de Lélang and Le Jeu de la Hache and things like this, the French were associated with the poleaxe, but so were the English as well. So the French and the English liked to fight on foot. So, therefore, one possible explanation is that because the English like to fight on foot, they require more mobility of their arms, and therefore they preferred either smaller spaulders with besigues in some cases, but then later on when they decided to go full in with the pauldron concept, and really just basically everybody was wearing large pauldrons, they kept a greater degree of mobility than we typically see, not always, we typically see in the Italian pauldrons. Is there any flaw to this theory? Yes, there is, in that a lot of the English actually wore Italian armour. So absolutely Italian armour was imported in large numbers. In some cases, French armour in the Italian export or Italian style was imported. The Earl of Warwick's a famous example. My good friend Liz wears a harness based on the Earl of Warwick, but do you know what she does when she fights on foot? She often switches out the large pauldrons for the large Italian pauldrons, quite similar to mine actually, for smaller spaulders and besigues because it gives more mobility of the arms. And I think that probably the English, even with the larger left pauldron, still wanted to maintain, despite the fact it gives you a huge amount of protection, especially if you're being shot at by the opposing longbow arrows, Yorkist or Lancastrian, or indeed French crossbow bolts. So this is more protective than a spauldar with a besigue, but it's still got a remarkable amount of flexibility and shoulder movement for a large pauldron. It's a good compromise between a lot of protection but still a decent amount of mobility. So generally speaking, here's the headline. My opinion is that English pauldrons tend to have better movement and sort of rotational possibilities than Italian pauldrons in general. Okay, obviously there's a big overlap, and sometimes the English use Italian armour, sometimes the Italians have other types of pauldron which are a little bit more flexible. And the final kind of cherry on top of the cake of my argument here is that if we fast forward to the time of Henry VIII, when Henry VIII was going to fight foot combats against the King of France, and we look at his armours there, we see that indeed he has because remember, this is a foot combat armour, this is specialised foot combat armour. He has pauldrons that essentially are like these. Although they're from the early 1500s instead of the late 1400s, they kind of have the same ethos as this. They don't have to have the cutout for the lance because they're not going to be used as lances. This is a foot combat armour. But they have a highly compressible set of lames, so that although that looks like a huge piece of steel there, it compresses up into a small space, and you've still got really good arm mobility, which of course is better if you're using a poleaxe or a two-handed sword on foot, where you don't need the massive shield-like protection necessarily of taking heavy lance impacts. Anyway, just a theory. What do you think? Do you think we're onto something? Do you think there's other nuances that I've missed? As always, I have been Matt Easton. I'll continue to be, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Take care, folks.